Here, everybody. This is like a rock concert, right? Crazy. I wasn't expecting a tea. Anyway, this is not what economists are used to, right? We don't usually get a rock star treatment. I feel like I'm going to sound like a bit like a broken record today because everything I talk about housing is always the same. Because you know what? The issues are the same, but we've made progress. What we need now is to move much faster and with a greater rate of urgency. So I've got 25 minutes to talk to you about what is probably the biggest issue that's facing New Zealand today. We know that these issues have been around for a long time, and we know that at its core, our housing system is broken. It's treated more like a thing that we use for financial investment rather than shelter and a human right. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Wairoa, where they have a housing crisis, where there are people on the wait list, and they only have 10 social houses there. There is no way they're going to be able to fix that problem quickly unless we intervene. But the problem is tractable. They only need 50 houses. If we can't build 50 houses in Wairoa, how are we going to fix New Zealand's problems? At its core, I think the issue is we are starting from a market that is dysfunctional. And when we look forward, I think the thing that we have to think about is, you can see that, the thing that we have to think about is, what is it that we really want to achieve? What are the outcomes that we want from our housing market? The big issue for us is, while we have made a lot of progress, you look at things like the NPS that came out earlier this year. I know geeks like me are super excited about it, but not many other people are. Maybe those of you who are geeks in this room are also excited. But things like the NPS are really quite extraordinary in that they are moving into that area of significant amount of capacity and capability for the planning system to respond. But we haven't moved at the same time with the funding capacity and capability of our local authorities to provide the underground and other infrastructure to make those houses happen. So it's not going to be fixed anytime soon because the reality is that there are so many parts of the housing system that is not quite working. But I'm really encouraged that when we were talking about housing 10 years ago, we were still arguing if there is a problem. Today, we're talking about what is the right solution and how quickly should we do them. This is a huge amount of progress that we've made as a nation and, of course, with our leaders and our participants. What we need now is a great deal of urgency and courage to try new things, admit failure, and move on when necessary. New Zealand has a culture of vilifying failure. And yet, if we don't try stuff and if we don't fail, we're not going to make things better. So I'd encourage you to think about over the course of what you do today, what you did yesterday, and what we take back to our community, is we have to try new things because the issues that we're dealing with are not things that are going to be resolved very quickly. A little bit of historical context. This is house prices relative to incomes in New Zealand going back to the 1950s. I've been showing this chart for decades. I feel quite old now. But, you know, it really kind of started in the 2000s when house prices really started to take off relative to incomes. And even though we've got interest rates that are extraordinarily low, the issue for most people is that they can't afford to save the deposit. Right? In the case of places like Auckland, house prices have increased by nearly 15% over the course of the last 12 months. When you add 15% on 900K, you know what? Your income is definitely not keeping up to save the deposit. So when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that people need to save up out of relatively modest incomes, the issue becomes quite problematic. In the early 1990s, you could save the deposit and pay off your house in usually around 20 years. Even though it was hard, it has always been hard to buy a house. Today, it's more like 40 plus years to get your deposit and pay off the mortgage. You have no time left to save for your retirement, and to do that, you have to both work. You have to work extraordinarily long hours, and you have to live in the middle of nowhere to be able to afford to do that. And the issues have become so bad in so many of our cities that we are exporting this problem to the provinces. Now, I think some of you will know that I'm no longer welcome in Wanganui because I called it a zombie town some years ago. Of course, I was wrong because places like Wanganui are growing, and they're growing really, really fast. And it's happening all over New Zealand. In the last census, every district bar one had population growth. Our cities have become so hostile to their citizens, we're exporting our people to places that have few job opportunities. You look at the chart on the left-hand side, or the map on the left-hand side, you can see there are lots of parts of New Zealand that were blue, where it was still relatively affordable to be able to buy houses. Fast forward to today, and you'll see that red has spread to many parts of New Zealand. The infection is spreading. When I was in Gisborne and Wairoa in the last month, we were seeing this incredible influx of population coming back. Population growth is good, but only if it comes with employment opportunities. If people are escaping high cost of living and poverty, and they're going to the provinces, all we create are poverty traps that are somewhere else, out of sight and out of mind, and that is not okay. In places like Gisborne, the median house price is now over $500,000. The people who live there can no longer afford to buy and afford to live in those communities. Places like Gisborne are exporting their people, the poor, out to places like Wairua. So when we have issues that accumulate over time, they can play out in unexpected and different ways. And the very obvious implication and consequence, of course, is that we've seen the rise of generation rent. In New Zealand, we have told ourselves that home ownership is a good thing, and it is, because it gives you access to security, both in terms of where you live, in terms of shelter, but also financial security, the access to capital to start your small business, and all those other bits and pieces that we know that home ownership affords in New Zealand. Except, of course, that's not something that's been improving for a very long time. For post-war, we had a range of public policies, range of interventions that were designed to get people into housing, and they were successful. You can see in the data that pretty much since the post-war era until 1991, that census in 1991, that home ownership rate in New Zealand was rising. Since then, it has been falling. Even now, we have nearly 2/3 of our households who own. But the problem, of course, is that many more individuals are renting now than ever before. At last count, over 50% of adults in New Zealand are renting. The politics is shifting. The people who live in their own homes and the people who invest are inevitably becoming older, richer, or who have parents who are rich. We are creating the landed gentry in New Zealand, and we are sowing these seeds of discord and social unrest for the future. These are things that will come and bite us in the ass at some point in time, and I'm sure that's the technical term for it. Now, not every part of the housing market is equally broken, right? I mean, when we talk about housing, we know there are some things that are fundamentally more important, and where the market prices are telling us that some things are just much more problematic than others. So if you look back to the 2000s, is it 2000s or early 90s? My eyes are not so good. But essentially what you can see over the course of the last few decades, incomes have increased, right? So roughly speaking, in the last 20 years, incomes have doubled. Rents have increased by 2.5 times, and house prices have increased by 4 times. Within that, what's happening is land prices have increased by an extraordinary amount. The biggest shortage we have in New Zealand is serviced land, land that is planned, that is serviced with infrastructure and ready to build. The cost of sections is extraordinarily high. If we can't massively increase land supply, particularly in places where we have access to work and other amenities, we're not going to be able to solve our housing crisis. So of course, we should be planning more. While we're going to have all the conversations about RMA and other things, I point you to things like the Unitary Plan in Auckland, where even within the confines of the RMA, we've been able to increase house building to record rates. So let's not try to fix everything in one go. Let's use the systems we've got, because you know what? There is a real sense of urgency to act now, and we have to use the systems and the structures that we have now and flex them and push them as hard as we can, so then we can deal with some of those issues. You're going to have Steve Evans on the couch later. You can ask him about construction prices. They've also increased, but not as much as land prices, right? We've got issues in every part of our housing market in New Zealand. We have to fix all of them, and we have to think about what are the fundamental constraints that we can move very quickly that's going to get us to the other side. A lot of the conversation around housing, of course, centers around demand. And I thought it was really ironic that in the latest numbers, we saw house prices across New Zealand was up something like, 17% in the last 12 months? This is in the middle of the biggest recession in 100 years. This is at a time when net migration is zero, when foreign investors are banned. We don't need help to have a housing crisis in New Zealand. We do it ourselves, and we do it by ourselves. Let's not try and blame other folk. The problem is we are really crap at building houses, regardless of what is going on. We got to fix that, and we got to do a lot more. So on the left-hand side is essentially a picture of what I think is housing demand versus what we're building. And you can see in the sort of that pinkish line that supply is increasing, but we got to build a lot more. The real issue is not so much that we're not building enough right now. The problem is we haven't built enough in the last 30 years. It's that accumulated deficit that we have to fix. And to do that, we've got to build at the current rate for the next 30 years to be able to solve it, right? So we've got to keep building in the capacity and capability of our industry, from planning to infrastructure provision to construction to prefab. All those other bits and pieces have to come together at the same time for us to be able to make that fix. But right now, what we're seeing in the market, of course, is that the demand that we're seeing for housing is not physical demand, it's investor demand. Investor demand is a huge part of why house prices in New Zealand are very expensive. We are very rich in New Zealand because we buy and sell houses from each other, and we're willing to pay higher and higher prices to each other. And that's fine, because the Ponzi game can go on until it doesn't go on, right? And essentially now what we have is a central bank and banking policy that allows our banking system to essentially lend only to housing. If you look at the chart behind me, you can see the recession, right? In the last 6 months, the lending to businesses and agriculture has crashed. So the bits of the economy that actually create jobs and incomes and lifestyles, there is no growth, there is no investment. And at the same time, lending to housing, to mortgages, has barely changed. We're still at record levels of borrowing. And of course, it makes sense that we should borrow money to invest in housing, which has no taxes, which is the only thing that you can borrow a ton of money for. What else can you get that kind of gearing for? So it's not surprising that's happening, but what pisses me off is a reserve bank that comes out and says, it's not our job to deal with this. You know what? It is the only job that is left. There is no inflation. You can't cut interest rates much more. The only thing you can do is how much credit there is in the economy and where that credit turns up. It's an abdication of their duty to say that it is not their job to direct where credit goes in the economy. I want the finance minister to set a very clear direction with the Reserve Bank to say, yes, we have a monetary policy targets agreement. We also need to tell you what financial stability means, because what you are doing is fundamentally destabilizing our housing market and our society. All right, that's good to get that out, because I've been waiting to say that in public for a while. Now, when we talk about housing, and I feel like I've been ranting about housing for so long that it feels very practiced. But in some ways, I think when we talk about housing, we started with the conversation about just saying, well, let's build more houses, right? And that's good, but I think we need to be a bit more nuanced than that. It's not just enough to build more houses. We've got to think about where the need is and where we're going to get the best bang for our buck in terms of creating better outcomes for New Zealanders that need it the most. So when you think about the housing market across the continuum, we know that there's a whole bunch of people, those people in the blue in the top of my chart, they're actually okay. They've got enough wealth to own their own home, and they're okay to rent their own houses. They're relatively secure. It's those people in the pink who are needing accommodation supplement, the temporary the TAS, people who are on emergency housing, people who are in public housing. These are the people that we really need to think about. How do we focus some supply for these people? Because if you're waiting for overall housing supply to catch up and then wait for that to trickle down to these folk, you know what? We're going to be waiting a hell of a long time. And that's not okay. And essentially, we need to start thinking about, yes, we've got to fix all those wider issues, but let us also talk about those supported and unsupported, those supported people who are desperately in need of our help. How can we deal with those people? Because you know what? Without giving them access to secure housing, the wraparound services, we're going to get all these other social and health issues that are not going to go away anytime soon. New Zealand has history that shows we can do this, right? This is the thing. We don't have to invent something new. We can look at our own past and see what we have done. One part of the story, of course, is our public housing system, whether it's Housing New Zealand or Kāinga or in its current incarnation. The reality is that we did a whole bunch of things in that post-war era that was extraordinarily successful. We built tens and thousands of public housing, but more importantly, and something that is lost on people, we also built huge amounts of private housing during the same time. The government underwrote greenfield developments. The government provided support for infrastructure. It capitalized the family benefit for people to get access to a deposit. It supported people with low-cost mortgages. There was a suite of connected things that built more homes and got people into that housing. But we didn't keep those policies. Over time, we became complacent and we did away with them. And of course, you can see in the chart what happened over the course of the last few decades. Really, the peak in public housing stock in New Zealand was in 1991. In absolute terms, that's when we had the most number of houses. And relative to population, that's been falling. In the last few years, we've clawed back quite a lot of it, but look at the level. It's an embarrassment. This is a really important public asset that looks after the most vulnerable in our society, and we have given up this extraordinary asset and extraordinary opportunity we had to look after people who are the most vulnerable in the society. We're planning to build about 6,500 homes for sure in the next 3 years, and probably a bit more. Before the last election, I think the total program was about 14,000. So over the next little while, we're going to get a lot of new public housing coming in, which is great because we need to do this. But currently, at last count, we had over 20,000 on the wait list for public housing. It's still not going to be enough. Right now, there is a huge amount of demand that is not going to be met by the supply that is coming. We are planning to fail because it's not enough to have just the amount that's on the wait list. You know what? There's a whole bunch of unmet demand that's there just in the wings of people who might be losing their job or have a family crisis or whatever else. We shouldn't think about having to house all of them in Kaingaroa housing. We have a chip sector that is extraordinarily capable of not only providing housing, but all the stuff that goes around it in terms of helping people how to be financially capable and all those other things that are extraordinarily important. And we need to work with each other. The reality is the problem is too big for us to solve it on our own. None of us can solve it on our own. We have to partner, we have to leverage, we have to push every lever in the same direction. Because if we don't, we are not going to be able to deal with a crisis that has been building for many decades to come, for many decades. And of course, the crisis has been building for so long, we spend an absolute fortune every year to look after these people, right? Whether it's around the accommodation supplement, the TAS, the emergency housing, the IRS, roughly, we're spending about $3.5 billion a year just to keep people some level of security in a fundamentally broken housing market. This is what we spend every year, and that's only going to increase, right? It's not going to go anytime soon. How do we create a fire break in this? Because to me, this is the problem. We're in a deadlock where we know that we've got to build more houses, but we can't. We can't move fast enough. When you think about spending $3.5 billion every year for decades to come, I asked myself, what is the cost if we could just borrow some money to help these people? Roughly speaking, that $3.5 billion at 1% interest rates, and it's less than 1% for government right now, we're talking $30+ billion of capital that we could borrow. We could practically give people houses that's costing us, I don't know what, nearly 100 grand a year to put them in emergency housing, right? You could practically gift them a house and would be better off. We need to create some sort of fire break. We have to give the government the social license to think differently from the way we have been doing things in the past. The reality is we've gotten ourselves into a trap that is extraordinarily expensive, both in terms of people who simply can't achieve the things that they want to achieve, but also from a fiscal perspective, the huge sums of money we're spending every year that is volume-driven. People just come in through the door and we have to help them because if you don't, they're going to be homeless. So the reality is that we have to be much more courageous about giving this government and future governments a lot of social license to try some new stuff. And the encouraging thing for me with COVID, of course, is that when a crisis hits, New Zealand is absolutely capable of responding, right? We're going to spend $100 billion to respond to the COVID crisis. Why can't we spend $10 billion, $30 billion to deal with the housing crisis? Why can't we spend that on health? Why can't we do $500 million a year on aged care? These are completely tractable in the context of what we've been able to achieve in a very short period of time. And I think we have some opportunities that are coming up. Whether it's for local government or for central government, we know one of the big things that has changed is right now, interest rates are extraordinarily cheap, right? So we should be using our balance sheets and our ability to borrow from markets to invest in the things that's going to make New Zealand better off. And one of the stories that you have heard yesterday and you're going to hear through today is New Zealand has not invested in any type of infrastructure for many decades. So you look at the chart on the right-hand side, that's New Zealand in the blue line, and the grey shaded area is the OECD. We suck. We haven't been investing enough in infrastructure for decades, and that's why we have the problems. But it's not enough to say we suck. We have to say, well, actually, we don't need this to happen. We're completely capable, both financially, fiscally, and as a country, to do much better. Our cost of borrowing is low. We have social license to do this. We need to ask our governments, I don't care what stripe, we need to ask our governments and give them social license to go, you can do this. We give you permission to try new stuff. And if you fail, we're not going to vilify you. We're going to ask you to do something different. Now, I don't have to take you through the Sweden's Million Homes program in detail, but I wanted to raise it as an idea. Because what it came from was an idea of the right values, that we have a housing crisis and a housing shortage. What we want to do is make sure there are enough homes over the course of the next decade, so we resolve this for once and for all. So they targeted 1 million homes. They had a population of 8 million at the time. And they did a whole bunch of things, right? They had generous state loans. They helped local authorities to supply land and the infrastructure. They had labor constraints, so they moved into prefab. They supported people into multiple types of ownership and tenure, whether it was public housing or whether it was built to rent or whether it was around progressive ownership products. It was all those things that they put together. That was the important part, right? And exactly what I told you about what we did in New Zealand post-war. So we don't actually have to have a Swedish model. There is a New Zealand model that works perfectly fine too. It's about being coordinated. Right now, the biggest issue that we face is our approach to housing is uncoordinated. We've got lots of people doing good stuff, but they're not pushing in the same direction. We're not working together, and we are bickering about whether it's our patch. If we don't change that, we're not going to be able to get around. So the Swedish lesson, for me at least, was not so much that we have to do exactly the steps that they took, but that they were able to work together and pushed every lever at the same time for a decade to get on top of the problem. So what do we need to do? Well, I mean, stating the freaking obvious, right? We've got to build more homes. But I think within that, state houses have to be an absolute priority, right? Yes, we have a program of 14,000. How do we make sure we absolutely supercharge the chips to also provide the social housing? Because you know what? The wait list is so big, we can't do it all on the back of Kainga Ora. They just don't have the capacity and the capability to do even more than has been asked of them. Let's give them enough room to deliver what we've asked them to do and leverage the expertise, capability, and complete willingness that exists within the chip sector to do this. You know what? These guys really care. They want to get good outcomes. We want to encourage that. We want to leverage that. We've got to do build to rent. The reality is that if we're going to do affordable housing, we have to use other tools like inclusionary zoning to go, when we're building housing, let's not just build big, expensive McMansions, let's also build some affordable houses. But we have to retain them. We have to hold those houses because we haven't built any affordable houses in New Zealand for so long that we can't afford to lose control of them. So the Queenstown model, where you might argue that it's not big enough, but at least they're trying. The retained affordable model is something that we absolutely must spread out to the rest of New Zealand, because we are capable of building houses, but not enough of those houses are affordable and hitting the right notes. Build to rent is obvious, right? Because when we build houses, most of the housing supply goes into the owner-occupier market because they have money and wealth, obvious. But the stress is in people who are renting. If we're not building housing for renting, we're not going to get on top of this problem because the next wave and cohort of people who are going to face housing stress are just waiting on the wings. We got to increase the supply of rental housing stock. Now, we know that we should do the stuff around small, close to amenities, transport, and quality, and all those kinds of things. And the program that we've had around our building code, around our NPS, around our unitary plan in Auckland, what's happening with all of that stuff, these are all heading in the right direction. We just need to bring it all together and supercharge the hell out of it. We have to sort out infrastructure. We know that the biggest issue for councils, and I talk to a lot of councils, as I'm sure you do, and some of you are probably from council, you know that we've run out of social license and financial headroom to do more. Imagine going out to your constituency and saying, we're going to raise your rates by 5% a year or 10% a year for the next 5 years. They're going to tell you to fuck off, right? You will not be re-elected. We've relied on local government to essentially do this for the last 30 years. They borrowed more and more, they've gone up to their capacity, and now the residents are telling us, we don't want to pay any more on rates. It doesn't matter whether you think it's cheap or not, it doesn't matter. The politics doesn't matter, and the politics matters. There is no social license for local governments to be able to do this. If we don't fix the funding and financing of local government, I think we're not going to be able to get on top of this. I think we need to favor a little bit of prefab, otherwise we won't get scale and speed. We have to sort out banks. We can't just keep lending to people buying and selling houses from each other. This is obvious stuff. We should probably do some sort of tax, but I'm kind of not worried about it because other places have capital gains taxes and they still have housing booms. And you know what? In some ways, we need to stop talking about home ownership. It's too late. House prices are too expensive. Let's talk about giving people access to secure housing because I reckon that's where we're going to get the biggest gains. So let me come back to where I started. The housing market currently is broken, right? We know that there is a whole bunch of things that we need to do around land, planning, financing, funding of infrastructure. We know all the tools. We have all the tools. The thing that's missing now is the social license that we give to our leaders, our politicians, at local government, at business, at central government, to say, have the courage to try new stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, the one thing I would ask you to really press onto our political leaders is ask them to be courageous and to work with a sense of urgency. We gotta have urgency because the crisis is too big and we cannot wait any longer. Thank you.